So first thing is I have not yet graded the homework, so I decided we're going to go over them in class on Tuesday. So the plan is next week on Tuesday, we are going to go over the homework for this week. There's also homework due Monday. It's going to get posted tomorrow morning. It is going to be about the fallacies we're talking about. It will be shorter and easier than most of the homeworks because I also want you all thinking about what sorts of things might be on the midterm. And then Tuesday, we're going to go over also what's going to be on the midterm. I'm not going to tell you the actual questions, of course, but I will tell you exactly like there will be this many questions that are of this type, this many questions that are about fallacies, this many questions that are of this type. So we can go over it. If anyone has any questions about anything that's going to be on the midterm, we will talk about that on Tuesday in class. And we'll, again, for those who just came in, we will also go over the homework that was due on this Monday and the homework due next Monday, because that's also going to be review, because the midterm will include questions like both homework. So we might as well just go over them in the midterm review. Any questions, comments, concerns, feelings, anything at this point? All right, in that case, let's jump into our fallacies. First off, let's do a review. What were the 5 fallacies we talked about last time? Anyone remember? Just want to do a quick review of what they were.
We had appeal to authority.
Yep.
I'm just saying the bad ones, not the good ones that you.
Yeah, the bad.
Okay. Straw man, I guess you say.
Authority. Straw man. Gotti, did you have one that you wanted to say?
Was it false dilemma?
False dilemma, yeah. False dilemma. Let's name the other 2 and then we can talk about what they are. What were the last ones?
Ad
hominem, yep. Ad hominem. I can't remember how to spell it. That's definitely not right. I'm just gonna do that and leave it to you.
Was the last one 2 wrongs make it right?
Yep, 2 wrongs make it right. So what were them? What was an appeal to authority? When you're appealing to authority and you're not doing it right, what is it?
And it's someone that has a power, but he's not an expert.
Yeah, it's you say something's true because simply because someone with power says it's true. And that person with power doesn't have any knowledge or expertise. It's literally just that they have power. What was straw man? This one's a little tough to define. So straw man. Oh, yeah. Gotti, I think I heard you first, so if you want to try.
All right. I was going to say simplifying an argument and then replying to the simplified argument to make it like easier. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. It's saying instead of arguing against someone's actual position to prove they're wrong, you simplify the argument and argue against that simplified version. So if somebody's trying to argue for why we should have off, weekends should be 3 days long. And you argue and say something like, this person doesn't believe in work or hard work or values, we shouldn't listen to them. That would be a straw man argument. What the person actually said is, I think we should have a weekend that's 3 days long. And instead you're arguing that this person doesn't believe that we value work or we should value work. That's a straw man. False dilemma, which one was that?
Or you're giving more options than, or there's more options than you're giving. Like you're saying there's only 2 options when there could be more in reality.
Exactly. So it's a case in which you say either this or this and not one of them, therefore this other one. When in truth, there are many, many, many options. So this is you're either with us or you're against us. And you're not with us, so you must be our enemy. When really it could just be like you're ambivalent and you have no issues at all on either side. Ad hominem is just attacking a person instead of their argument. And then what was 2 wrongs make a right? So ad hominem is basically like name calling. What was 2 wrongs make a right?
Isn't it when you try to justify if you did a wrong, but you try to justify, try to see the positive in it, but even though it's still wrong, like the example you gave us I mean, I crossed that red light, but at least I didn't kill anyone, you know?
Yeah, so it's trying to point out the positive by trying to cast what you did in a better light by comparing it to someone else. So you say, I did a bad thing, but that's okay because someone else did a just as bad or even worse thing. So yeah, those are 2 wrongs make it right. So those were the 5 we talked about last time, and now we're going to bring up 6 more. And all we're going to do is get through this 6. So the first one is a non sequitur. So the reason we're going to talk about non sequiturs first is because Christmas is my favorite holiday. You're all on mute, so I couldn't actually hear any hums. Did anyone audibly hum or look confused?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, it was the one we're going to talk about first is non sequiturs because Christmas is my favorite holiday.
Are you trying to give us an example of a non sequitur?
Yes, I'm giving you an example in the first thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a non sequitur is an example of where the reason you give for something has nothing to do with the conclusion you're arguing for. So it's any sort of case in which you say one thing because of something that has absolutely nothing to do with it. Another one is like the politician's way of you get asked a hard question and as an answer to it, you just start telling a story that's only tangentially related. So if somebody's like, Mr. President, Miss President, Madam President, what are you going to do about immigration in this country? And this person just starts going, well, you know, when I was a young person growing up in Iowa, and I would look out on those cornfields and I would think to myself, wow, one day I really wish I could be president, but I don't know if I'm ever going to get there. Now I look back on those times and I think, what amazing times and what a great nation we live in. That's a non sequitur. When you don't answer a question, you just tell a story or you argue for something by giving a reason that has nothing to do with it. So does that make sense to everyone? What a non sequitur is?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so you can think of a non sequitur is closely related to an ad hominem argument in that an ad hominem argument is kind of a type of non sequitur, where if I'm just attacking your character or your person or your characteristics, then that's one way of talking about something that has nothing to do with what's at issue. And so the related reason, the related good thing way of reasoning is if you actually give a genuine good related reason, genuine related reason as part of your argument. So instead of saying something, you know, if instead of trying to prove that, if instead of saying something like, we're going to talk about non sequiturs first because Christmas is my favorite holiday. If I had said something like, we're going to talk about non sequiturs first because that's the first one that was in the textbook. Or we're going to talk about non sequiturs first because I think it's the easiest one to explain. Or I really, really like Christmas trees because Christmas is my favorite holiday. All of those are not non sequiturs. Those are genuine related reasons for an argument. A non sequitur is when you present something as if it's a reason when it's really not. Good?
Yes.
All right. Appeal to ignorance. Does anyone know what an appeal to ignorance is? Or what is it to be ignorant about something? You can answer either question. Either
not knowing what you're talking about, like just pointing out what.
Yeah. So not knowing is an appeal to ignorance. So in this case, it's a specific type of not knowing. In particular, it's a case in which you say something is true because we don't know it's not true. So can anyone think of an example of this? You find them on the internet all the time in which someone argues for something by saying you can't prove it's not the case.
Conspiracy theories.
Yeah, conspiracy theories, any type of conspiracy theory, appeal to ignorance is a very common one. So it'll be something like, you can't prove the moon landing happened. So you can't prove that the moon landing didn't happen. No, you can't prove that the moon landing did happen, therefore it didn't happen. Or you can't prove that the government isn't putting microchips into our vaccines, therefore they are putting microchips in. Netta, did you have something you wanted to add? Or Kosi, either one?
I had like an example of like, I think sometimes when politicians like they do speeches and they give out like those statistics and like you don't really know what's true because you can find like data that matches either way.
So that's actually the misleading statistics is a slightly different one. So an appeal to ignorance in this particular case, because ignorance can be used in a lot of different ways. And so this way of using misleading statistics is something we're going to come back to, but misleading statistics is a slightly different sort of case. That's actually going to be more related in with small sample and unrepresentative sample. But the general idea with an appeal to ignorance is it's a case in which you try to show something is the case by showing you can't show it isn't the case. So another one is like, you haven't proven to me that there's no aliens in the universe, so therefore there are aliens in the universe. Maybe there are, but that's not a good reason to think definitely there are, that you can't show there aren't. Why is this such a bad argument? What is the issue with an appeal to ignorance? Well,
There's no credibility, right?
Yeah, there's no credibility. And the real issue is there's no way. I mean, this argument is what it's called, just to put up a technical term, it overgenerates. And when something overgenerates, what it means is it does more than you want it to. Because in truth, if you appeal to ignorance, you can prove the existence of anything you wanted. So for instance, I have a invisible tiny miniature elephant in my hand right now. And you know how you should know that this elephant's here? Because you can't prove it's not here. Is that any good reason to think I actually have an invisible elephant here?
No.
No. I mean, like, how many of you, if you were betting, would bet that I actually have an invisible elephant in my hand? Hopefully none of you would. That would just be a way of losing money. So, but in that same way, the same appeal to ignorance argument that you use in anything else can be used to argue for anything, because you can't prove definitively 100% certain that something doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, it's not there for you to point to. If something does exist, you can point to it and say, hey, look, it's right here. Here's proof that it exists. But I can't prove something doesn't exist because it's not there to be pointed to. Does that make sense? So an appeal to ignorance argument is always going to apply because you can't prove a negative. So therefore, it's just this argument that you could use it to argue for anything. And because you can use it to argue for anything, it's not going to tell you the difference between proving that something's true and something's false. It's going to lead you to the conclusion that every single thing you imagine is true. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, appeal to ignorance, the best way to think of it is the sorts of arguments you'll read online for conspiracy theories. You can't prove that 9/11 wasn't an inside job, so it was an inside job. Anything like that. And people love conspiracy theories, and it's a bad way of reaching a conclusion. Now, appeals to ignorance, though, part of the reason they look so good, other than the fact that we love conspiracy theories, is that they are related to a good way of reasoning. And I don't have a shorter way of putting this, but the best way of thinking of something that's related to an appeal to ignorance is there are cases where if you don't find something, it's a pretty good evidence that it doesn't exist. And those are cases in which if it existed, or if you looked for it and you don't find it, or if you looked for it, it's likely to be there. So for instance, if I'm looking through my apartment from my wallet and I look in every single room and I don't find my wallet, then I can probably safely assume that the wallet isn't there. I can assume the wallet must be somewhere else. And it seems like I can come to this conclusion that it isn't there because I've checked every single room. I know all the places it could be, and it wasn't in any of them. Now, there's always a chance that it like fell under the couch or something like that. So I can't be 100% certain. But if I look for something and it isn't there, then I have a pretty good way of concluding that it's not the case. So does that make sense? That difference here. Appeal to ignorance is you can't prove it isn't, so therefore it is. Compared with I searched for it and didn't find it, therefore it probably isn't there, or it probably doesn't exist.
So it's like with the vaccine, people will, make up a conspiracy but they never did the research, or let's say they did try to prove their conspiracy was true, but they never found it. So then is that
Exactly. If you were to use the argument of there's microchips that control your mind in the vaccine because no one's proved there isn't, that's a bad way of reasoning. But if you try to prove that there are not microchips in the vaccine, there aren't microchips in the vaccine, and you do this by looking at all the vaccine samples and looking at every single one and not finding any microchips, then you can be pretty certain that there aren't any microchips. Or on the flip side, if you were to look and actually find microchips, there aren't any, but if there were, then you'd have good reason to think, yes, there are microchips here. So it's the difference between saying, I looked for it and didn't find it, versus you couldn't find it if you looked for it, therefore it does exist. So does that difference make sense to everyone? It's somewhat intuitive if you just think about like the conspiracy theory case. We all good?
Could you just, I guess, briefly go over that again? Just
Yeah, so an appeal to ignorance argument is one in which you say something is true because you can't prove it's not true. So it must be true that 9/11 was an inside job because you've never proved that it wasn't an inside job. Or autism is caused by vaccines because no one has ever proven to me that it wasn't caused by vaccines. That is an appeal to ignorance. The reason that it can be appealing is pointing out the non-existence of something, or trying to point to the non-existence of something, or the non-presence of something, is sometimes a useful way of reaching a conclusion. So if I look in, if we are trying to figure out if there are Martians, and we look on every corner of Mars and cannot find a single Martian, then we have a pretty good way of concluding there aren't any Martians there. So it is possible to look for something and then come to the conclusion that it doesn't exist, or that something is false. But it's not possible to go from the fact you can't find something to the fact that therefore, or you can't find not something to the fact that therefore something is true.
so the appeal to ignorance would be like, I guess you would say you can't prove Martians don't exist because of whatever reason versus.
No one's ever proven that Martians don't exist. We're not 100% certain of it. Therefore, they must exist.
Okay, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can see intuitively, it's like a pretty bad way of reasoning. All right, slippery slope. Have people heard of a slippery slope argument?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Anyone want to try to say what it is?
Like if
Can I
Give an
try?
example.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, my
bad. No, you got it.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think it's when like someone is making an argument and then the person committing the fallacy starts to essentially, it's kind of how like when your mother says that if you try one puff of marijuana, you're going to end up like dead and addicted to heroin in a street alley, you know, like they kind
Exactly.
of skip the middle steps and go straight to the worst possible conclusion.
That is a classic slippery slope. The gateway drug argument for if you smoke one joint, you're going to become addicted to marijuana. Once you're addicted to marijuana, you're going to start snorting cocaine. And once you start snorting cocaine, you're going to be on the street shooting up heroin, and then you're going to die. That is a very, very good, excellent slippery slope argument. That is the case in which what's the problem with this sort of argument? Well, it's very persuasive because you're saying one thing would lead to another, would lead to another. Yeah, Breaking Bad. That's a case in which it actually did lead. One thing led to another, led to another. But the issue with the slippery slope argument is the sort of case in which somebody says something is going to cause something else, but in truth, there's no logical connection to it. So for instance, if you smoke a joint, there's no guarantee that you're suddenly going to become addicted to cocaine. Yes, occasionally individuals who smoke a joint then eventually become addicted to cocaine, but it's far, far more likely that a person who smokes a joint does not become addicted to cocaine. So that is a classic, excellent slippery slope argument. Does anyone have any other examples that they want to share?
Can it be like when teachers tell a student they're not going to make it anywhere?
Say a little more about it.
Like, oh, he's going to end up in prison?
Yes, that sort of case of he didn't do well on this test, and therefore he's eventually going to end up in prison. Like, that is a huge jump. Somebody not being good in a math class is in no way a sign they're going to end up in prison. Even if someone is a bad student, like, they talk back sometimes, that's in no way a sign they're going to end up in prison. Yeah, that's another good slippery slope. Other ones are things like, at about the time that legalizing gay marriage was an issue that people were discussing, there were a lot of arguments against gay marriage that went something along the lines of, if you let a man marry a man, then where do you stop? The next thing you know, men are going to be marrying children, and then they're going to be marrying their dogs. And, once they're having sex with dogs, the whole society is going to fall apart. That's a slippery slope argument. Somebody having a relationship, someone getting married to a man who is also a man is not in any way going to mean we're suddenly going to have marriages to children and marriages to dogs. So a slippery slope argument is any sort of case in which you say, if A, then B, if B, then C, if C, then D, and now, so we shouldn't A. Now, the key is this though right here, the if A then B, if B then C, if C then D, so if A then D, this should look familiar. Because why? Why does this look familiar? Think back to your valid argument types. What was this type of argument called? Where you go, if A, then B, and if B, then C, and if C, then D, then therefore, if A, then D. That is a good way of arguing in a certain context.
Is that a hypothetical?
Yeah, hypothetical syllogism. What is the key difference then between, because at first glance, and the reason a slippery slope looks so good is that it looks like a hypothetical syllogism. The key difference is, in the case of a genuine hypothetical syllogism, there's an actual connection between each step. So in an actual hypothetical syllogism, the difference is here, let me put up two. If you smoke a joint, then you'll become addicted to cocaine, and once you're addicted to coke, you'll become a meth addict and die. Versus, let's see, one board here. Contrast that one with if I get sick, I'll stay home, and if I stay home, I'll miss class. So what's the key difference here between these two? What's the difference between this bad slippery slope? If you smoke a joint, then you'll become addicted to cocaine, and once you're addicted to coke, you'll become a meth addict and die, versus this one?
It's way more probable to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Each step actually makes the case. It's actually true that if I get sick, there's a genuine connection between my getting sick and staying home. And if I stay home, then I will miss class. Like there's connections here. Another way of putting it is these premises are just straight up true. Over here, this is just very statistically unlikely. Like the number of people who become addicted to cocaine just because they've had a joint, very small. This is false. It is not the case that if you smoke a joint, you're guaranteed to become addicted to cocaine. So that's the main difference between a slippery slope and a hypothetical syllogism. It's just that a hypothetical syllogism has good, true, reasonable premises with connections between them, and a slippery slope does not. All right, that's up.
So would you say that a slippery slope is a variation on a false assumption?
Yeah. Yeah, a slippery slope is a variation on having a premise that you're assuming is true, which isn't actually true. That's a good way of thinking of it. Yes, Sandra.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was actually my question. If it's like the slippery slope like ignores other options and give you like only one option when there is actually more options that
Yeah, I mean, you can, that's actually really clever. I never thought of it that way, but it does have a little bit of a overlap in some ways with a false dilemma, but it's more, yeah, it's trying to say the only possible conclusion that happens if this happens is this other crazy thing, when in truth, there are many, many other things that could happen there. All right, let's get on to any other questions on these ones? Also, that was such a good example of a slippery slope that illustrated it super well. All right,
It was
sampling.
awesome.
What is sampling, or taking a sample, and what is the point of it? We will then talk about small and unrepresentative, but I just want to talk about what sampling is first.
like a group, it's like a group, like a test group, I guess.
Yeah. What is the idea behind sampling? Where are some places that you see people doing samples and test groups and things like this?
Research?
Yeah, so any sort of research or politics. And the basic idea behind it is what? So the idea would be that I'm trying to make, sampling comes up in one of two contexts. Either one, trying to draw general conclusion, or two, trying to predict future. And so what sampling is essentially is you look at a lot of individual cases to either detect a pattern that will allow you to predict what's going to happen in the future, or to draw a more general conclusion about an even larger group. So for instance, if you're doing research in a medical situation, when they were testing the COVID-19 vaccine, they couldn't test it on every single person in America before they gave it to every single person in America. So what did they do instead?
They take like people from, they try to represent like most of society
Yeah.
in one group and then test it.
Yeah, so they take a smaller number of people than the entire American population, and they test it on that group of people. And so what they do is they take a sample of the population, and then from that sample, they try to find out they try to draw a general conclusion about how effective it'll be for the population at large. So when they did these studies and they found like this was 90% effective at stopping the virus, what they were doing is they didn't test it on the entire population. They rather looked at a small group and said it was 90% effective here. And because this small group is supposed to stand in for the entire American population, the goal was to think if it was 90% here, it's also going to be 90% here. And in the same way, the goal was we'll try it on a bunch of people and see if there are any bad side effects on that small group. If there are bad side effects on small group, then we'll go back and try again. But if there's no side effects on the small group, then we are going to try to guess that there's no side effects on this larger group. And maybe we'll be wrong, but because we tried it here, it's likely to be true for the entire larger group as well. So that's the idea of sampling in terms of trying to draw a general conclusion. The other way you do it is when you're trying to predict the future. So give me 1 second. My pen is dying on me. So you see this type of sampling a lot when it comes to hiring someone for a job. So whenever you're in charge of hiring someone, what are you trying to get? Who are you trying to acquire when you're hiring someone new? Who do you want? Describe your ideal candidate.
Someone who's responsible, who's like taking initiative. I don't know.
Yeah.
something like that.
And basically, you're going to want someone, simply put, you're going to want someone responsible and taking initiative and creative, because that's going to make them damn good at their job. Now, you're therefore trying to predict how well this person's going to do in the future at their job. So ideally, you'd be able to just go forward in time, see how they do. And if they don't do well, then you hire someone else. But of course, you can't do that. That's not how time works. So if you want to know that someone's good at a certain job, what's the best way of deciding whether they're going to be good at that job?
Ask them about like past experience, maybe.
Exactly. You look at how well they did in the past. So this is especially clear in like a sports setting, where if you're like the general manager of a sports team, the person who decides who to spend your money on the roster, the best way to try to figure out who you should get for your team is you look at how this player did in a previous season, or how well this player did for your team in a previous season. So in the same way, if you've been a computer programmer for 20 years and I'm working at Apple, I can look at how well you did at Google and use it to make an educated guess about how well you'll do at Apple. I'll look at maybe your most recent job to see how well you did in that one to draw a conclusion. So that's what it is with sampling. Now, you're not going to try to look at every single moment that you ever did. So for instance, with you can also think of letters of reference as sampling, and also references for a job as sampling. You don't ask someone to tell you about you don't ask every single person that a person has ever met how good they are at something. You instead just get like a handful of recommendations or references, and that's meant to stand in as a sample of how this person did as a whole. So does that notion of sampling make sense to everyone? And it's a very useful tool. Can anyone think of any other areas in which sampling is crucial while I take a sip of water? So far we've had medicine, we've had predicting sports players and job performance. What are some other things?
Politics.
Politics is another good one. You try to predict what's going to happen in a future election by looking at how people fare in a previous election. Or you can look at who you think is going to win the presidential election based on asking a small percentage of the American populace who they're going to vote for, and then draw a more general conclusion from that. So political polling is another big one. Anyone need any other examples, or are we pretty good with how sampling
I was
works?
about to say consumer research, when they want to test like products before they do that.
Consumer research is a really, really excellent one. So yeah, companies don't just like whenever a company changes their logo, it's not like some graphic designer decides like, oh, we're going to change the logo today. Rather, what they do is they have what are called focus groups. Anyone know what a focus group is?
They just get like a bunch of people and then they ask them what they think, and they show them and they see their reactions. And
yeah, so basically what they do is they bring a bunch of random people into a room and ask them, they'll hold up like a picture of like, here's what we're thinking about for the Coca-Cola ad. How does this one make you feel? Now, what about this other new Coca-Cola ad? And so this group is meant as a sample that's supposed to stand in for the more general population. So if they love the new Coca-Cola, if they love, say, Coca-Cola, new Coca-Cola logo A, and the focus group is like, about Coca-Cola group B, or new Coca-Cola logo B, then you think, all right, we're going to choose logo A because we also think the American population as a whole is going to prefer A and therefore be more likely to buy Coca-Cola if we go with A. So that's another really good example. Do we need more examples, or is everyone on board with how sampling ideally works and what it's meant to do?
I'm on board.
All right, awesome. Now, sampling, however, can go wrong. So if you were designing, say you're trying to get a focus group, and you are trying to, or say I decide to run a focus group, and I'm trying to find out what the most popular major is at Baruch. and I'm trying to figure out what the most popular major is. I can't take the time to ask everyone. I can only ask, say, 25 people. If I want my sample to be good, what do I have to ensure?
You have to make sure that you're taking your sample demographic from a place that would accurately reflect the entire student body. So for example, maybe you could go to like the student cafe or the library, but you shouldn't be going to like, I don't know, the business department or
Yeah. That's exactly it. So one thing you need is if you're trying to draw a general conclusion about an entire group of people based on a smaller number, you have to make sure that the smaller number you're asking is representative, has the same general demographics as the group that the larger group you're trying to represent. So for instance, if I were to go to, say, the business department lounge and ask 25 people what their major was, I'm going to get a very skewed understanding of what the different majors at Baruch are. Because if I'm going to the business department lounge, I'm probably going to find 25 business majors. In the same way, if I'm trying to identify how often the average New Yorker goes to the doctor a year, and I just asked you all in this class how often you go to the doctor to try to draw my conclusion, what would be the issue with this? Why is my conclusion probably going to be wrong?
well, we're all the same age.
Yeah, you're all pretty much on the younger side. Younger people, generally speaking, go to the doctor a lot less than old people do. Old people's bodies are breaking down and they have to go to the hospital more, the doctor more. So if I'm trying to get a representation of how often New Yorkers go to the doctor, I need to ask a much larger group of people. I need to ask people of different races, of different ages, of different socioeconomic classes, because that's the only way I'm going to get a good understanding of what New Yorkers do. So if I do not have a good sample, it is unrepresentative. It does not represent the larger group. The sample does not represent or stand in for the larger population. Let me think of some other non-representative samples. Or can anyone else think of a good case? You could have come across it. Oftentimes, like news articles like bad news articles online or bad online arguments will constitute a point to an unrepresentative sample. I think a closely related one is when you point to personal experience or to what your friends think. So like if you come to the conclusion that, if you are a huge fan of Marvel movies and all your friends are huge fans of Marvel movies and you've never seen a Marvel movie you didn't like, you just give them all like 2 thumbs up, A+, and all your friends do as well, then the fact that if everybody you ask says it's a good movie isn't necessarily going to say whether it's the larger population considers it a good movie. Ryan.
I feel like, could you use an example of almost like someone asking, I guess, like at like an NRA meeting, how they all felt about gun control? You know
Exactly.
what I mean?
If you ask everyone at a National Rifle Association whether gun control is a good thing, and they all say, no, gun control isn't a good thing. And from that, you conclude, look, most Americans don't think gun control is a good thing. That is a classic case of an unrepresentative sample. And so is it being biased? So yeah, basically what an unrepresentative sample is your sample is biased compared to what the overall group is going for. So it's related to being biased. Or you can think of it as a special type of being biased. One way in which a conclusion can be biased is because the people you polled or the people you sampled are unrepresentative of the larger population. Now, here's another one. If I wanted to find out what percentage of people of Baruch were different majors, and I decided I was just going to be, I don't feel like asking a lot of people. I'm just going to ask 2 of you. So I asked 2 of you what your major is. And from there, I conclude that half of Baruch is accounting majors and the other half is philosophy majors. What is the flaw in that way of sampling?
That there's not enough people that you that you.
Yeah, that is a small sample size. So small sample or small sample size is the other way that sampling can go wrong. And the reason why this is bad is just because if you have a single event or a small number of events, the odds of something crazy happening go up significantly. So for instance, in this case, how many of you have done something? How many of you have experienced beginner's luck in something where you did something for the first time and you were really good at it, and then any other time you've ever done it in your life, you were terrible at it? Or even an event where something that you're usually not that good at, but you had one day in which you were just amazing at it.
It's
Has anyone
happened.
ever
I mean,
had this experience? Yeah.
I don't remember
like
which
everyone
what exactly, but yes.
Wait,
it
say
has
that again,
happened.
Natalie?
I don't remember exactly what the situation was, but yeah, it's happened.
Yeah. So exactly. It's just the idea is that anytime something happens where, because it happened on a small number of times, if you throw a dart one time in your life and you hit a bullseye, then if you just looked at that, you might predict this person is the greatest dart thrower in history. But if you just look at one time and you get it right, you can't draw a conclusion about someone's overall ability. If you see me do something great one time, I could be terrible at it every other time. So that's what a small sample is. So small sample is when your group is so small that you can't actually get an understanding of what the larger group feels because you've only asked a tiny percentage of it. So this is the same sort of thing where, for those of you who are sports fans, every once in a while you'll have somebody who the first game of their career is amazing, and then it turns out that they're actually bad, and it was just they got lucky or had a good night. So that's the idea with small sample. That's the idea with unrepresentative sample. And so a good sample, by contrast, is one in which the number of people you're sampling or the group you're sampling is large, and it represents the larger population very accurately. It's got the same demographics as that population, and there's a large number of people you're asking, so you get a pretty good idea of what the larger group is going to think. That all good?
Yeah.
You said it's both large number of people and also what you said?
Representative. So bad is small, unrepresentative. Good is large, representative. So you have to have them both, and then you get a good sampling.
Thank you.
All right, and the last one is questionable cause, or correlation does not equal causation. How many people have heard the phrase correlation does not equal causation?
I've heard it.
Yeah.
Anyone else have heard it?
Yeah.
What is it? Does anyone
No.
want to try to explain what it means, or does anyone feel confident they can explain what it means?
I'm gonna try, but I feel like it means like just because something has happened in the past doesn't mean there's proof for it to happen in the future. I don't know if that's
So no, you're very close here, Olivia. That's a very closely related thing, and that's part of it.
Can I
Kyriakos,
try?
did you want to say? Oh, Sandra.
Is it? my bad.
Kyriakos first, yeah.
Is it like a slippery slope where there's no clause?
It's similar, where in the same sort of way in which there's no connected cause between the two things. But unlike a slippery slope where it's just a matter of somebody's imagining the two things go together often, a correlation does not equal causation is a case in which two things do happen near each other in time. And therefore, somebody comes to the conclusion that one caused the other, when in truth, that isn't the case. So a classic example of this is how we got the idea that the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, people came to think it caused autism. So what was the reasoning that people thought this vaccine caused autism? Does anyone know this story about why this happened?
I know the story.
Yeah.
I'm like involved in a lot of like child development stuff. So basically it was like autism does tend to rear its head around the age that you get a lot of vaccines, like around about 3 years old. But the real reason was basically just the psychologist who was trying to prove it. And he totally falsified a lot of his research, and he's literally been discredited by the entire academic community. And one Google search will tell you this. So
Yes.
like
Yeah.
Which is why like this particular argument frustrates me to no end because I work with special needs kids, and the amount of times I've actually heard that, like, it drives me nuts. It drives me
Yeah,
nuts.
and so there was basically a scientist who falsified a lot of data, but a lot of the reason why people were willing to think his data was good was the simple fact that here's something that happened a lot. At around age 3, a lot of children were getting the MMR vaccine and lots of other vaccines. And then shortly thereafter, a lot of children who showed autism, or here's another way of putting this. A lot of the children who showed autism, very often shortly before they showed autism, they had gotten the MMR vaccine. So you had a number of children who got the vaccine and then started showing signs of autism. And so people were concluding, this happened first, this happened second, so the vaccine must have caused the autism. But in truth, why was it that this child was showing autism shortly after the MMR vaccine? Well, it had nothing to do with the vaccine. It rather entirely had to do with the fact that the child was 3. The child was 3, and at age 3, here's 2 separate things that happen with children. 1, they start getting a lot of vaccines. 2, something so completely separate, they reach a developmental level that the signs of autism start to show. Basically, before you're 3, you're more or less too much of a vegetable to show any sort of social cues one way or another. So the sign between a 2-year-old is not going to have the behavioral differences between an autistic 2-year-old, a 2-year-old who will eventually become autistic versus a 2-year-old who will not, because 2-year-olds are not socially developed enough for one to tell the difference between an autistic or future autistic and a not future autistic. However, by age 3, you start to have a non-autistic child will start to show social development that an autistic one will not. So it just so happened that the fact that the child had turned 3 led to them starting to have these vaccines. And also someone at age 3 starting to have autism showing, therefore came to the conclusion that MMR caused autism, when in truth, it didn't. There is no evidence whatsoever, it's been disproved, nothing whatsoever that the vaccines are causing autism. It's rather a bad scientist falsifying data combined with this correlational being interpreted as a causation. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the idea here with correlation not equaling causation. And there's actually other ways in which 2 things can be correlated together, but be caused by something else. So another thing that can happen is we can have a case in which 2 things happen side by side, and we think that A causes B, when in truth, B causes A. So an example of this might be something like, I always have trouble thinking of examples of this one, but can anyone think of a case in which people often think A is the cause of B? So that's what people think, but in truth, it's the other way.
Isn't a perfect example like the vaccine right now? Like people are always, saying that getting the vaccine will make you sicker. But then in reality, I guess I'm not a scientist, but it's supposed
I
to
think
not
you're
to, right?
close here. I think there's something close here, or think of a
Like how the vaccine is supposed to, people think the vaccine will make you feel worse or make you turn into a zombie when in reality it's supposed to protect you from, actually dying.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of if I can put this in a straightforward, take this example and put it in like a very straightforward, clear way. I think
Isn't it like, okay, no,
no, go ahead, Nita.
I just thought of the example, how sometimes people say the chicken and the egg, you don't know which one came first.
So yeah,
so you could say it this way, but you can also argue it the other way.
Yeah, so it's closely related to a chicken and egg. Here's one. I imagine you're a child, and imagine you're a dog. Imagine you're a dog and you have to go to the vet. And every time you go to the vet, you feel bad. So as a dog, what does the dog think? How many of you have dogs or cats that hate going to the vet?
Yeah, they relate that area, that
So,
office.
and what's
to-
going on in their little animal minds is they think this vet is causing me to feel bad. So my going to the vet is causing me to feel bad, so I hate the vet. When in truth, they're going to the vet because they feel bad. It's the feeling bad causes them to go to the vet, not the going to the vet that causes them to feel bad. So that's a case in which you get the thing turned around. Other ones are, you know, Kyriakos.
Can it be like going to an amusement park, and most people might suggest that going to the amusement park is fun, but in turn, me myself is gonna have a bad time if I go?
So that's not, I'm not sure if that's quite the same thing. It would be more like a case in which
Could it be like when you go
people-
to the dentist? You go to the dentist.
say
to
that
get
again.
your-
No.
when you go to the dentist, you get your teeth fixed or get a root canal. It's to feel better because, you know, but then you associate the dentist with being so painful that you, but they're actually helping you.
Yeah, that would be that one's a little closer where you think the dentist causes discomfort when really it's the discomfort that causes you to go to the dentist. Or if you have a case in which you say, well, I go to the amusement park because it's fun, versus I only say it's fun because I went there and I feel guilty about it. Like I spent so much money and I didn't really have fun. So why did I go? My friends said it was fun, but in truth, my friends only said it was fun because they wanted me to go, or something like that. That would be another one where it goes the other way. More commonly, it's these sorts of cases of where there's some third cause, that is one thing causes two other things. And in truth, these things are not, we think one thing causes another, but in truth, they're both caused by some third thing. And then the third way in which correlation cannot cause causation is just pure dumb luck and just statistical oddities. And the basic idea is, because there's so many things happening in the world and they're happening so often, eventually some weird things are going to happen. And you might even have a case in which two things that are totally unrelated to each other happen to increase and decrease together. There are some very good examples of this, of just like very silly correlations. So if you actually just look at a large enough sample size, like for instance, if I just jumped up and down enough times in my life, eventually there's going to be some moment I jump that looks like it caused someone to die, simply because I happened to be jumping at the moment somebody happened to die. And even with enough people in the world, if everyone jumps, say, once a day, there's probably some person who every time they jump for a week happens to jump at the same time someone dies, just because that's how numbers work. If enough people are jumping once a day, somebody's going to happen to be lined up with when someone happens to die. But that in no way suggests any causal connection between the two. It's rather just complete dumb luck. So for instance, let me pull up this website that I very much enjoy. See if I can find this. Spurious correlations. So, for instance, somebody decided to crunch some numbers and found that the number between the years 1999 and 2009, so those 10 years, there was a very, very close correlation between how many people drowned by falling into a swimming pool and how many films Nicolas Cage appeared in. So if you look at the chart, what you see is like as one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. So if you just look at this, it can start to look like Nicolas Cage movies cause people to drown in their swimming pool. When in truth, it's just, if you look at a large enough sample size, there's going to be some weird correlations between things. So that's what the third way of correlation not equaling causation. Now, it is true that sometimes when two things happen together, it's a sign that one caused the other. And the way you prove that one thing is causing the other is if A happens and then B happens, and A happens and then B happens, and you're starting to think A caused B. Well, how do you test to see if A is actually causing B? Well, what you do is don't do A and see if B still happens. So for instance, in the autism case, if you don't vaccinate your child at age 3 and they still become autistic, then that shows that the vaccine is not what's causing the autism. So does everyone understand? So there are cases in which things genuinely cause one another, but just because two things happen together, they're correlated together, does not mean that one causes the other. So whenever you're coming across something, and you can also often find things like America's #1 selling toilet paper. So you might think something like the fact that it's the #1 selling is a sign that it's good toilet paper. And so you might think like goodness and #1 are being correlated together. But really, there's this third cause, which is just like this is the cheapest one and it's sold in the most stores. So does everyone understand this difference between correlation and causation? Correlation just means two things move together. When one gets more likely, the other gets more likely. When one gets less likely, the other gets less likely. When one happens, the other happens. Causation is when one is literally making it the case that the other one is happening. And the fact that two things are correlated, moving together, happening together, does not necessarily mean that one is making the other one the case. All right. Any questions on that last one?
All
right, in that case,
I think I'm good.
Okay, in that case, I've got nothing else I want to say. I'm going to stop the recording.